Hey everyone. Thanks again for participating in this assignment for me. As you know, I wanted it to be this public literary event where people got together and I would tell a story and then there'd be a video behind me, but because of the whole coronavirus thing, that just can't happen. So I'm doing a video, and this is what that is all about. Don't think of the video like it's a film. Think of it like it's a story, like it's an audiobook. But along with the audiobook, there's going to be video that's going to complement it, and there's going to be audio. There's going to be sounds that complement that. So think of it in terms of this person who did something and then wrote a story about it, and it's based on that. A lot of the things happened, but a lot of them didn't. And then afterwards, when it's all said and done, I'll send you an email to get some feedback from you and find out what you thought about it. So again, thank you for your participation. These coronavirus times, we live in strange times. So thanks again. The legend is this. In 1870, late at night, during a heavy rainstorm, a train bound for Pine City near Devil's Lake. It was a circus train loaded heavy with gear. At the lake, the train tracks ran along a very steep embankment before entering the town 2 miles to the north. The legend says that a woman in Pine City reported hearing the train's whistle that night, but the train never arrived. It had been raining for 3 days straight, and this night, the heavy rain loosened the dirt and rocks under the train tracks, and when the weight of the huge steam locomotive hit the tracks gave way. It hit the water sideways, and after the huge explosion of water and steam cleared, only the dark, pockmarked surface of the lake remained. The water was almost 100 feet deep. The train's cars, not as heavy, broke free from the locomotive as it wrenched downward. One, carrying the canvas and poles for the huge tents, was partially submerged, but it remained connected to the cars on the hill, grasping on like to a saving hand, it not allowing it to sink below the water. The engineer of the train jumped out of the cab toward the hill when he felt the train sliding downwards. He survived, but his leg was broken in the fall. There were 3 other people in the engine cab with him that night, but the following morning, they were still unaccounted for. The sheriff waited 2 days before pronouncing them lost, presumed drowned. They were never seen again. They were Melvin and Julianne Bumfrey, a married couple, and Elmer Thackeray, a circus laborer. Over 100 years later, the circus train story surfaced at a backyard barbecue. Eating cheeseburgers and potato chips and drinking beer, Troy said he had been researching this legend of the circus train. He'd gone to Devil's Lake the previous winter and climbed down the steep embankment onto the thick ice, lowering his sled with his gear. It wasn't a very big lake, he said. Using an ice fishing auger, he drilled a series of holes in the ice, spacing them apart. He lowered a video camera used for fishing and scanned the deep water for any signs of the locomotive. On the 3rd hole, shivering and nearing his limits for the cold, he lowered the camera down to 70 feet, and he said he saw what appeared to be the shape of the locomotive. He calculated landmarks and noted the location. He said between mouthfuls, "The next step is to do a dive on it." James told him he'd done a lot of diving back in his college days in Hawaii. "You want to do the dive with me?" he asked. James said, I really want to do it, but I need gear. I don't have my own gear anymore. I'm assuming full wetsuits for the cold? Troy laughed. "Oh, yeah, it'll be cold down there once you get past 15 feet or so. The images I got said 72 feet, so it's a ways down. Definitely chilly, but don't worry. We'll be able to rent everything we need to make it work. It'll be fine." 70 feet. Whew. I've been to 100 before in Hawaii, but that's warmer, of course. It'll be fine. I haven't done many wetsuit dives, though. Troy said, don't worry, we got time to figure it out. I'll call you. We'll get a plan. Sounds good, said James. Sounds like fun. On his drive home, James had reservations about agreeing to do the dive. Most of his diving had been in clear tropical waters with good visibility. He'd only done one scuba dive in a lake, and this was 15 years ago. Lake diving in cold, turbid Minnesota waters was a different beast. Not much margin for error, especially if you go deep. Years back in Hawaii, James was forced to make a free ascent from 80 feet deep because he had run out of air. That had been a stupid mistake. But in the car that night, after the barbecue, he finally thought, I can handle this dive. He was older now and wiser. He was confident it would all come back. He needed an adventure. When Troy called 3 weeks later with a plan, James said, I'm all in. The night before the dive, they met at the dive shop to pick up the rental gear. Troy had already tried on his wetsuit, and the owner handed James a suit to try on in the dressing room. He struggled to get it on, but finally he got his arms in the sleeves, but it wouldn't zip. Out in the store, he heard Troy say to the shop owner, having the zipper on the back of the suit is weird. James looked down at his chest and the open zipper. He thought, mistake number one. Glad I'm on dry land. The next day, they ate breakfast at a diner on the interstate, an hour away from Devil's Lake. Troy had brought along his friend Mark to paddle the kayak. He would tow us to the right spot on the lake. James said, so we'll know when we're near this sunken circus locomotive when we see old red rubber clown noses drift by? They laughed, and Troy said, yeah, that's it. But get this, the old guy whose dock we're using told me that there's a woman in Pine City, a waitress, who says that sometimes she has dreams or she sees a light and hears a train whistle. Nah, for real, said Troy. If we find the train, we'll go find her to hear that story. The day was perfect for a dive. The early afternoon sky was a pale summer blue with big, white, puffy clouds drifting slowly. The lake wasn't big, maybe 500 yards across, but it was deep, close to 100 feet. The slopes leading down to the water were covered with trees. The surface was a dark color, not blue, not really brown. There was a slight breeze, just enough to give some rolling ripples to parts of the lake surface. The air was a comfortable 85 degrees. We arrived at the second of only 2 houses on this lake, and Troy rang the doorbell. An old guy with whisker stubble answered the door. He confirmed that we could use his dock to stage the dive. Mark stood behind us with our 2 tanks. The old guy looked at the tanks and then at Mark. Are you sure you got air in them tanks of yours? Mark smiled and said, sure do. You know what the Buddhists say, breath is life. The old man said, you don't need a goddamn Buddha to tell you that, do you? He rubbed his chin. All I ask is that if you find it, I get pictures. That we will do, said Troy. That we will do. They carried their dive gear down to the dock and began. 15 years of not diving meant the gear was new to James. Instead of a weight belt, the weight slid into pockets on the buoyancy vest that held the tank. The neoprene wetsuit's float. Since he hadn't done many wetsuit dives, 1 to be exact, he didn't know how much weight he needed, now to compensate. He'd need enough so that he could descend. He put in 20 pounds, then he put it on. With the tank, it was heavy, walking on the dock, and with the spongy black wetsuit on, cumbersome in the hot sun. James clumsily sat down on the edge of the dock and put on his flippers. He spit in his mask, swirled it, put the regulator in his mouth, and rolled forward into the warm 80-degree water. He splashed under and watched air bubbles amid the shafts of sunlight on the surface. He could feel water seeping into his suit, cooling him off. It was fine. It felt good again to be in the water. He breathed in through the regulator and exhaled. It all worked. Mark was in the kayak. Trailing behind the kayak was a nylon rope, and Troy and James grabbed a hold and Mark paddled. It took about 15 minutes to get to the spot. The water under the surface was cloudy with particles of green algae. They could see down the rope through the green water about 10 feet. 10 feet visibility, good enough. Ready, said Troy. I am. Let's go. They turned on their dive lights, pushed the buttons on their inflated vests, and the air hissed out and Troy descended under the water. James descended several feet but immediately floated back up. He tried releasing the air in his vest again, but it was already empty. He couldn't descend. He needed more weight. Damn, he thought. Mistake number 2. Luckily, Troy surfaced shortly after, and James told him he needed to go back to the dock. Sorry about that. It's okay, Troy said. See you in a bit. It's spooky down there. It's dark. Troy filled his buoyancy vest and floated. He didn't want to be down there alone. At the dock, James added 6 more pounds, and that did the trick. He got up to Troy after Mark paddled him back out, and they turned on their lights and descended. This time, he sank down. He followed Troy down through that murky green slurry. After about 10 feet, James pinched his nose and pushed air out to equalize the pressure in his ears. He'd need to do that every 10 feet or so. They were going down to 70 feet. At 30 feet, the water was getting darker, the sunlight being blocked out. Troy slowed down and James passed him, following the rope down, shining the light on it through the darkening deep water. The water was getting colder now, and James noticed the light only illuminated about 5 feet down the rope. He pinched his nose and equalized his ear pressure again, and then rolled over onto his back and looked up and saw Troy about 10 feet above him, following him down. James turned over to face bottom again. The water went from darker, murky green to swirling particle black to pure black, black as ink. The line between the two was discernible. James descended into total darkness, and the water got cold, very cold. Like ice water, probably 50 degrees. He became disoriented in the dark, and then his ears hurt, so he pinched his nose to equalize, but he had no reference now as to how far down he was. He was free-floating in the blackness, not knowing which direction was up or down. He heard his breath tightening, holding, with the exhaling of the bubbles as he continued to descend. He was spooked by it and delayed pinching his nose because of that distraction, and his ears hurt bad by the time he did equalize. He was overwhelmed and thought, why the hell did I do this? I know better. The dive light shined straight ahead and he saw nothing but black. The freezing water was still seeping into his suit, and then he felt his fins touch mud on the bottom. He was down, 70 feet under in cold black water. He had expected to see swirling sediment if he shined the light on it, but he saw nothing. Ahead of him, nothing. He remembered to focus on breathing so that he wouldn't hold his breath, but he knew that he was on the edge of panic. Slow it down, he thought. And then he saw a light, Troy's light, barely visible, not far off in the distance. It swung right and then left, and then it disappeared. They weren't that far apart. James pushed off from the bottom to go towards Troy's light, but his head hit hard on something solid. It hurt. He pointed up with his light, and a foot away was the thick black limb of a sunken tree. He pushed off to the right and bumped into another limb, hitting his shoulder. Panic filled his throat, and his chest tightened. The fear came into him then. He swung around to back away and brushed up against more limbs, his jerking light showing flashes of a web of black branches. He spun to the right and he felt trapped within the branches. He pushed away, but one of the branches hooked into his tank harness. He kicked hard in the dark, but it held fast. He began hyperventilating. Swung hard to break free, but a branch in the dark caught his regulator and ripped it out of his mouth. Mistake number 3. He reached with both hands, trying to find it, and couldn't. He tried to find his secondary regulator, but the water was black and he was thick in the branches of trees. Nothing was where it was supposed to be. He was at the edge now. He knew it. No more air. Just as he was about to suck in water, he felt water swirling around him and he felt himself falling, like being sucked down a drain. And then he was free of the tree. He looked around in the blackness. When he settled, he was in a large, dark, water-filled cavern. There was a faint light, light enough to get his bearings. He still needed to breathe, so he did. He sucked in, and the flow into his lungs was wet, cold, and thick like maple syrup. He floated and breathed, calm now. That was close, he thought. Off in the distance he saw a faint light, so he moved towards it. As he got close, he saw that it was the locomotive. The huge steel hulk resting on the side of the slope, the back of it partially sunken in the mud, large clumps of mud and algae hanging off the enormous steel wheels. A faint yellow light was shining in the cab. When he got closer, shadows of 3 people were there, standing in the cab where the engineer usually stood. It was Melvin and Julianne Bumfrey and Gaptooth Elmer Thackeray. He thought they were looking at him. He smiled and waved once, and they acknowledged him. James hesitated and then decided to go up to the surface to get his bearings and to check on Troy. He pushed up through the darkness and into the green water, and soon he was seeing the sunlight at the surface. He floated on his back, looking up, the warm water lapping against his cheeks while the sunshine warmed his face. On the edges of the blue sky, the wind was blowing the cottonwoods, and the leaves made that rushing water sound. It was a muffled sound, so peaceful. He looked over towards the dock, and there were people, about 5 of them, standing there. He could see Troy and Mark among them. They were looking at the water, and then they reached down and struggled and pulled up a body in a wetsuit. 4 of them grabbed it and dragged it limp up onto the dock. 2 of them panted heavily from the exertion. James just stared. It spooked him seeing that body. It spooked him because the body in the wetsuit looked like his. He watched the men struggle to put it on a wheeled gurney, and they pushed the body slowly up the path. He decided that he didn't want to go over there, not just yet. He knew Troy and Mark would wait for him. He wanted to see the train again, one last time, and those people inside. James lowered himself down through the green water to the darkness again. The water swirled him down, and there it was, the huge locomotive in the distance. The faint yellow light inside looked warm. But when he got closer, he saw the 3 of them in the cab, all frozen, looking ahead, their faces white, grease paint white, formed in grimaced agony like masks. On Elmer's nose was an old, faded red rubber clown nose, mushed in on one side. James got closer, and when he got near to the cab, with their frozen white faces, all 3 heads turned slowly in unison towards him. He froze, terrified, and then all 3 faces broke into smiles. Melvin Bumfrey then reached up and grabbed the handle on a hanging chain. He pulled down. James heard a train's whistle, far away and lonesome, deep in a dark valley. It sounded miles away. In that black, watery darkness, James drifted slowly towards the faint light of the locomotive. Inside, the 3 figures stirred, waiting for him. The waitress in Pine City, she had another dream that night, and it was different than before.